Welcome to Writer's Corner here at WinCam. My name is Joe Viglione, host of Visual Radio, and I'm here with Dr. Louis M. Cohen, author of No Good Deed, A Story of Medicine, Murder, Accusations, and the Debate Over How We Die. Hello, Dr. Cohen.
Joe, it's a delight to be here.
It's great to see you. Your second book, but your first national book.
And first book directed directly at the general public.
That's what I meant to say. Thank you. March 31st is a special date that impacts this book, or the book impacts the date.
Yeah. March 31st, 5 years ago, was when Terri Schiavo died. And this is a book that's very much about end-of-life issues, and it's been one in which it's given me an opportunity to look a little bit more into that situation and meet some of her family and try to understand their position.
I can't believe it's been 5 full years today. It just goes by, you know, many people in the public on the edge of their seats. It's like people on one side, people on the other, and it created a lot of debate.
It did at the time, and the interesting thing for me was to discover that the issues never went completely away. They're still there, and they're popping up in very different ways, but they're underlying the surface.
I've got to ask you about the title of the book. The late David Brudnoy, I was blessed to, David would go to the same movie premieres I went to because he was a movie critic.
Yeah.
And I'm a movie critic, so I'd be sitting in the front, and David would usually sit like in the middle. Joyce Culhaywick would be in the back. In the old days, you know, and you'd have it, and then the Phoenix and the Globe and everything. And I got lost, and David couldn't speak, and I was in the wrong subway because I usually drive. Mm-hmm. And David saw me, and he couldn't talk, but he put his hand on my shoulder, and he like pointed and bless you, and it was good to see him one final time, you know. But the reason I bring up David Brudnoy is he would always say, "No good deed goes unpunished," which you attribute to Claire Booth Luce.
Yes, the wife of the Time magazine and the publishing empire, and an author and playwright in and of herself, and quite a vibrant, sassy lady.
No good deed goes unpunished, meaning that for some kindness, sometimes there's the other side of the coin, a little bit of, I don't want to say hatred, people being upset with kindness.
Yeah. We're going to talk about the central plot of this book. On one side, you have some protagonists who feel that they did a good deed and lo and behold got punished for it. On the other side, you have an individual who simply feels that no good deed was performed and that a terrible thing had happened.
And to digress just a little, Brudnoy was on BZ. You were on BZ last night with Dan Ray?
I was.
What time?
I was on from 9 o'clock until 10 last night.
Oh, that's big time on a station that's a clear channel, not Clear Channel the company, but a clear channel right down this side of the Mississippi. It goes entirely down the East Coast.
And I got to follow the governor reporting on the floods that he was investigating throughout the state. So it was really quite a thrill. But it was also a thrill to meet Dan Ray because I was so struck by what an engaging and compassionate man he comes across on that station.
He's a veteran. He's been around a long time.
Yeah.
Step into David Brudnoy's shoes, big shoes to fill. Yeah. But I'm glad he's having authors on. That's a good thing. And this is TV. What was it like being on radio as opposed to TV? You don't see, you know, you don't see our audience either, but, you know, radio's such an instant medium.
It is an instant medium, and certainly the format of the show you're talking about, where it's a call-in show primarily, you don't know what's coming next, who's going to be calling up on that line and what background they're from. I was thrilled. It just so happened a number of nurses called up, and this is a book whose protagonists were nurses or nursing staff.
Interesting. It took you 7 years to write this.
Yes. This was an endeavor of passion.
When did you start, if I can ask?
Well, I'll tell you how I started. I can tell you that better than what the date was. And how I started was kind of derived from the fact that I am a physician who has been interested for a long time in how people make the decision to stop life support treatment. And I had spent a fair chunk of time talking to other physicians and talking to patients and patients' families, but I'd never actually gotten around to talking to nurses, and had decided that I needed to redress that and to sit down one by one and do some interviews with some nurses and ask them their experience specifically of stopping the life support treatment of dialysis. And in the course of doing that, suddenly some stories were unfolded, including the central one in this book, which, again, like a phone call on the Dan Ray show, came out of left field.
Interesting. The reason I had asked the date was, since Terry Schiavo's been dead 5 years now, you started this before that whole thing. So what were you building on before that event happened? The nurses that you would discuss things with?
Yeah. I mean, your question is, perfect in explaining a little bit who I am, because, as I said, I'm a physician, I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor at Tufts School of Medicine, and what I also am is a palliative medicine physician, a palliative care physician.
I don't understand the term.
Okay. And it's a term that is just sort of coming into the parlance. There's a new specialty that's come up. And let me add the word hospice into it. So hospice and palliative medicine are all linked together. And what we're talking about are individuals who develop a specialty in two things. One is attending to symptoms that people have and doing what they can to help people to not suffer. And the second, which is very related, are all the issues attendant to people dying.
And that is I pause because, it's a tough one to wrap my mind around. We don't want to think of death, My friend and I rescue cats. So we lost Tiger a couple of years ago. Just having to make that decision to end Tiger's life was really traumatic for me because I was so bonded with him. And I've had lots of cats, and I bond with all of them. But Tiger was very special. He'd hug me. And then his little legs went, and the doctor said, I can't tell you what to do, but he's going to be in a lot of pain. And it's like, I've got no choice, doctor. I've got to put him to sleep, I wasn't going to let him just take him home and let him shrivel away, in pain. I just couldn't do it. And I think maybe that's a good thing to bring up right now. Animals. With animals, we can make that choice. And it's a hard choice. Even though it's available, it's still devastating to me. With people, it's even worse sometimes.
And I can see that in your face, and I know that the viewers are sort of shifting in their own minds, thinking about animals and how much they love them, but in truth, how much more important their loved ones are, who are family, and the kind of situations that all of us are going to experience in our lives as we encounter either illnesses on our own part or illnesses of loved ones, and just what are our limits in terms of what we can do.
Quality of life.
Yes.
And does this book address quality of life?
It does. And it addresses it, again, from the standpoint of palliative care, which puts quality of life really on a pedestal and says that people themselves, people and their families, are the ones who are in the best position to judge what is a reasonable quality of life, and that they should have as much say as is humanly possible to make the decisions that are important when it comes to medical care.
I wouldn't know what to do with the Terry Schiavo thing. I just, it costs so much money to keep someone on life support. But then other people have been resuscitated. But they say she was beyond hope. Who can make these calls?
Well, that was an incredibly complicated situation, made all the more complicated because you had family members, on one hand, her birth family, the Schindlers, taking a certain stance, and you had her husband, who was the individual according to law, who ultimately was the one who got to make a decision, and it was a decision that her birth family was totally opposed to.
And you also had such a high level of politics I've never seen over that issue.
Yes.
Probably the ultimate case of politics getting involved in family business.
When the President of the United States interrupts his vacation, a man who's notorious and beloved perhaps for enjoying his vacations as much as he has, to rush back to Washington to sign a law saying that they can't pull a feeding tube on Terry Schiavo, we've really reached the top of our government chain.
But that was a president who thought nothing of killing people on death row or, lying us into a war. I don't mind saying that.
Yeah, yeah.
So this right to life, he thinks nothing of being the executioner.
That's right. That's right. And it's the complexity that we can almost never disentangle, that the very people who will maintain, for example, pro-life stance are the same people who very often will stand up and say, yes, let's execute the people who we find guilty of murder.
Tough calls. I usually read my books on the treadmill. And this morning at 10:17, I looked at the clock. The UPS man is walking up the steps, so I open the window and say, hey. He hands me the book through the window. So obviously I haven't had a chance to read it. I like to be honest with the audience. Some of the books I get to read in advance, some I don't. But this is good. I don't mind that I can ask the author, did you go to Italy to write some of this?
Yeah, in fact, I was very fortunate. This book was one that caught the attention of the Rockefeller Foundation, which sent me to Italy for a month. I
wasn't sure if it was for this book.
Yep.
It was?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So what is that? That's like an award or a grant?
Yeah, the Rockefeller Foundation has a thing called the Bellagio Residency, in which it selects a dozen scholars from different disciplines, musicians, artists, writers, and puts them up, I'm almost ashamed to say, in a villa in Italy without the distractions of real life, and gives them a chance to work on various projects and to cross-pollinate with different ideas that they might have.
Don't be ashamed. I can just tell flipping through the book, you work hard, so, and these are interesting topics, so you deserved it. And my next question about it is, did you get to go into any parts of Italy specifically for the book, or did you choose to?
Well, there's a interesting phenomena about what the Rockefellers are looking for from their scholars, and that is that they, in fact, don't leave the villa, but stay put and concentrate and focus on the topic. But my topic was, during that month, to try to make sense of an international perspective of end-of-life care. And so I spent a fair chunk of that time on the telephone or Skype or via email on the computer, reaching different people in different countries around the world to, in fact, get an international perspective.
Now, this villa, are there a lot of other people in it, or just one person at a time?
There's a dozen scholars. At my particular visit, there was an opera singer, there was a Chinese music composer, there were 2 poets, bioethicists, and so on. So about a dozen people.
Now, hopefully the opera singer can't be heard while you're writing your book. All due respect to her, she's probably fantastic, but that would be jarring for me.
She was fantastic, and she lent an important piece to the whole experience. Yeah.
Interesting. So it was a month in the villa. You mentioned computer. I was going to say Vincent Bugliosi's been on the show a couple of times.
Yep.
By phone, and he told me that he does everything by legal pad, and then he gives it to someone to, type. But he doesn't. He avoids the computer. Doesn't have a website. You have a computer, so you were typing it in and doing your phone work. Did you tape interviews over the phone?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. I met hundreds of people, either directly or through the phone, for the purpose of trying to get different perspectives of my subject. And I really haven't actually told you, we haven't narrowed it down what the subject is, but I met hundreds of people, did audio tapes of the interviews that I conducted. And in the book, all of the names are the people who I spoke with. There are only 2 names that were adopted at the request of others, but literally from hundreds and hundreds of people, they stood behind what they wanted to say and they wanted their name on it.
Interesting. If we can shift gears a little, I'd like to talk about your first book.
Yeah.
What was it called?
Well, let me start by saying what it's about, which is it was about people who have multiple personality disorders. And it was a book that was a textbook, and it was called Dissociative Identity Disorder. And then the subtitle referred to the controversies in the diagnosis.
Was it a university press? Or?
Yes. Yeah. It was indeed, and it was really geared towards academics, towards psychiatrists, psychologists, who at that moment in time, and I'm talking about probably the mid-late 80s, were diagnosing people with this disorder every which way. Everywhere you turned, there was somebody else who was being diagnosed as having dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder.
Interesting, and I would imagine there are very specifics, and some people will probably bring it into a gray area. I mean, actors can get into character.
And in fact, what the controversy really had to do was exactly that, which was, is this a disorder that is suddenly everywhere to be seen, or is there kind of a social construction that's taking place now, and that people in some ways, and this is because our society was where it was at that moment, constructing artificially a disorder out of a tendency that we all have to assume different personas.
They've shown me videotapes of myself crawling through ceilings in nightclubs in Boston. They told me I was a performer years ago. I don't believe it, but, you know, I've seen these videos. Again, we all have different aspects of our personality, and we change as the years go on.
Certainly.
But how long did it take you to write that? I won't stay too long on that book, but how long?
That was actually a very quick project that went on for about a year and a half, and that was sort of the total time.
Interesting. You do write a lot of articles.
I've published hundreds of articles, hundreds of chapters, and the vast majority of them have been in the area over the last 20 years that has been the passion for me, and that is end-of-life issues, very specifically of people who have kidney disease, people who are on dialysis, people who have had transplantations, and looking at these things from a psychiatric end, from a physiological end, from an ethical end. What happens when these people sort of reach the end of their rope, and in particular make decisions to stop a life support treatment and to die?
So this is zeroing in on basically kidney issues, not people with the right to die with other things, cancer or other ailments?
Well, the main stories that this book is built around just happen to be people who are maintained with the life support treatment of dialysis, but it is just as applicable to someone who is on a ventilator, someone who is being maintained with blood pressure medications. It really has sort of greater ramifications than the 300,000 people whose lives are being prolonged at this moment with dialysis.
300,000.
Yeah.
So, which brings me back to the title, and if you want people to read the book to get the answer, that's okay too. But no good deed. We talked about Terri Schiavo. Is it often a question of people making that decision going to be haunted by, say, other family members or even politics or even the law? If people make that decision, is that where no good deed comes from as well?
One could go in that direction and take that interpretation of it.
But someone's going to be unhappy if someone pulls the plug.
Yeah. Well, in truth, and this is where the book really starts, that's not in fact the case. There are many, if not most, cases in which, and it isn't an elegant, term to say pull the plug, but I use it like anyone else does. But to stop life support treatment sometimes seems like the most correct thing to do at the time that one could possibly do, and it can be ennobling. And I'll give you two examples that come from this book. Both involved patients who had been on dialysis for a number of years. One was a man who was a shoeshine man in Springfield and who had come in the course of his work to meet and to charm hundreds of people. And he had been on dialysis for some time, came into the hospital. He decided he had had enough. He had gone as far as he wanted to go with this, and he was facing amputations.
Oh.
He was facing the complications of diabetes that was sort of progressing. And he decided...
Exacerbated from the kidney?
No, actually the kidney disease had been caused by the diabetes. That was the underlying disease, as it is for many people who develop kidney disease. They start as diabetics and then they develop other complications, including kidneys. He stopped his dialysis and word got out into the community of Springfield. And people began coming into the hospital to say goodbye to him. And when I say people started coming, there was an avalanche of people who came into the hospital. Hundreds upon hundreds of people came to the hospital to say goodbye to Ben Babcock because they loved him. And it became, this decision of his, one of the most beautiful experiences that you could possibly imagine. For him, it was like It's a Wonderful Life, the movie. He knew suddenly how many people he had touched. For his family, again, moving experience. For the community, an opportunity to say goodbye to someone who they cared for. And for the staff who had taken care of him for many years, again, sort of an opportunity themselves to come on in. So with jazz playing in the background all the time, because he was a jazz aficionado, this man died having stopped his life support treatment and dialysis. And rather than anybody feeling regrets about it, it was something that uplifted everyone who was involved.
Was it a painful end?
No. It was not, and it is not usually for people who stop dialysis. It's something that there's a gradual loss of consciousness after a few days. One slips into coma, and one goes with relative peace, and in his case, certainly with a lot of peace.
C. David Heyman was on our show maybe about 8 months, a year ago. He wrote Bobby and Jackie, about Bobby Onassis and Bobby Kennedy and Jackie Onassis, Bobby Onassis. They were bitter rivals, if you will, or enemies. But when Bobby Kennedy was dying, he was in that state where someone had to make the decision, and Ted Kennedy didn't make it, and Ethel didn't make it, and it says in the book that Jackie Onassis went in and she signed the form, and she's the one who gave permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting, with a major figure like Bobby Kennedy, reading it in black and white, what happened. It's important. We don't want to go there. Like I said, it's like one of those things. It's like, I love talking to authors. I like talking to you. The topic is unnerving.
It is, but the more we can talk about it, the less unnerving it's going to be. The more we can get on the same page about these things, the clearer such decisions are going to become. And when you take a large family, as you're mentioning with the Kennedys, a prominent family, a very Catholic family. There are going to be a whole bunch of factors that are going to come into play, and there'll be people that may divide on different lines. And certainly, again, the Schiavo case, as you mentioned, which the death happened today, was one of those cases in which families absolutely split. But those are the ones that I think end up, even now, to be the exception. And certainly my hope is that as we sort of progress in time and we're more able to talk about these things, you look at somebody who's dying, and after a while it becomes kind of obvious that there's something unnatural about what we can do to merely keep them breathing, merely keep their hearts going. Or at least, again, that's the stand that I came into thinking about writing this book. And I got to tell you, what the book brings up, though, and lays out is another stand as well.
Do you have a website, Doctor?
We have set up a website for the book. There's actually two. This is published by HarperCollins, and they have an author page, and it's possible just to go on the HarperCollins website and it will connect. But No Good Deed Book, the book.
No Good Deed, the book.
No Good Deed, the book.
.com.
.com.
We'll bring you to your page so people can correspond with you.
And I would very much like to hear what people have to say.
NoGoodDeedTheBook.com. You can correspond with Dr. Louis Cohen about his book. You can talk about his previous book. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything else we left out that we should zero in on?
Well, we probably should zero in on the central story of this book, because unlike the Schiavo case, in which you had a dispute between family members as to whether or not to stop the life support of pulling a feeding tube, this book is about two nurses who participated along with the family, the doctors, in stopping the life support treatment of dialysis, and who, after the patient died, one of the nursing assistants at the hospital felt uncomfortable about what happened, approached the district attorney, and said that she felt a murder had been committed.
Whoa.
And so the reason that murder is there in the subtitle is very much because a full-fledged murder investigation was launched aimed at trying to determine whether the two nurses had killed this patient.
And I said murder accusations without, like a comma was there, a story of medicine, murder accusations.
Yep.
In the debate over how we die. Wow.
Yeah. And I'm glad to talk about the debate over how we die, but the central piece in this book is what happens to two nurses who do what they think was the right thing, and then kind of out of left field, they discover that there's somebody who feels quite to the contrary, that they've committed a crime. And you have a district attorney who's going to take it seriously and going to investigate them, and they're going to be facing all the potential consequences of such an act.
The landmines that, the legal landmines that they'd have to go through.
Yeah. And in turn, what I found was that they're not alone among medical personnel who have been accused of murdering patients. That there are a number of doctors who I interviewed in different states who had been accused and sometimes even found guilty of murder before the justices were able to take another look and throw the cases out.
Wow.
There were other nurses who had lost their jobs. And what it speaks to is, and this is where you started really, the underlying conflict that goes on in our society even 5 years after the death of Terry Schiavo between what's the right thing to do as people approach the end of their lives, how far should we go in terms of offering them artificial props, artificial life support treatments, technologies to keep those bodies going.
Wow. How are we doing out there for time? Because sometimes we do a 60-minute show. Is this a 30? This is a 30-minute show, so as the Oracle in the Matrix says, our time is up. And no good deed. Dr. Louis M. Cohen, thank you so much for being on the show.
This was a great pleasure for me, Joe. I enjoyed meeting you, but also a chance to talk to your audience about this. And if they want to get in touch with me, I hope they obviously get a chance to read what I think is a pretty moving and fast account of an interesting and personal story. But if they want to get in touch with me, I'd appreciate if they did.
Great, and you're welcome back anytime here at Writer's Corner.